What if the next move in this war isn't a warning, but a decision that's already been made? What if the bombers are already in the air before anyone in Washington says a single word out loud? Before we go further, I want 30 seconds of your time. If you want to actually understand what's happening instead of just reacting to another scary headline, hit that like button right now. It helps this video reach more people who are trying to make sense of this war instead of panicking about it. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and if someone in your life keeps asking you what's really going on with Iran, send them this video. Let's break it down properly right now tonight. American military power is moving toward Iran in a way the world hasn't seen since this conflict first started. This isn't rumor. This isn't speculation from some anonymous account online. This is happening in the open, visible on flight trackers, confirmed by officials, reported by multiple outlets at the same time. Long-range stealth bombers have been flying missions out of their home base in Missouri. These aircraft are built for one specific purpose. They can fly halfway across the world, strike a target, and return home without ever landing anywhere near the region they just hit. That capability alone tells you something about the kind of message being sent. You don't need forward bases if your bomber can reach the target and come home in the same breath. But right now, forward bases are being used anyway, and that detail matters more than it might seem. Think about what that actually means for a second. If the bomber can already do the job from home, then flying it forward isn't about capability. It's about visibility. It's about making sure everyone watching, allies and adversaries alike, can see the buildup happening with their own eyes. A quiet military would keep this kind of movement hidden. A loud one wants it seen. What we're watching right now is very clearly the second kind. At the same time, activity has picked up sharply at a key base out in the Indian Ocean. More bombers are being positioned there, sitting ready, waiting for very little notice before they're airborne. A second wave of fighter jets has been flying out of a base in England, and multiple reports suggest these aircraft are carrying bunker buster weapons, the kind built specifically to punch through hardened underground structures. Analysts describing the situation have used a simple phrase: the engines are warm, everything is ready. The only thing missing is a single order from the top. Overnight, the skies over Iraq and the Persian Gulf lit up again. New footage confirms this was the 13th consecutive night of American strikes on Iranian targets. 13 nights in a row, not one pause, not one quiet night. This time, the strikes focused on drone storage sites, command centers linked to the Revolutionary Guard, ballistic missile depots, underground bunkers, and fast attack boats. The small aggressive vessels Iran has used for months to threaten commercial shipping in the region. 13 nights is not a small number when you actually sit with it. That's almost 2 full weeks of sustained air operations, night after night, without a single break in the rhythm. Campaigns like this don't happen by accident, and they don't happen cheaply either. Every single night represents fuel, munitions, maintenance crews working around the clock, and pilots flying missions deep into contested airspace over and over again. A campaign this consistent tells you the decision to keep going has already been made. The only open question left is how much bigger it gets from here. Those fast boats have been a real problem for a long time. Merchant ships moving through these waters have been harassed, threatened, and in some cases attacked with very little pushback. That appears to be changing. Now, in a major announcement, the American president confirmed that $2 billion in frozen Iranian funds will be released and paid directly to the shipping companies whose vessels were damaged. For the first time, the Revolutionary Guard is being held financially responsible for what it's done at sea. Not just militarily targeted, financially punished. This matters more than it might sound like at first glance. Military strikes destroy equipment. Financial penalties destroy something harder to rebuild. Trust and stability within the organization itself. When money that was meant to fund operations gets redirected to pay off the very companies your forces attacked, that sends a message internally too. It tells everyone inside that structure that actions have consequences beyond just losing a boat or a base. It hits the accounting ledger, not just the battlefield. Backing all of this up is a specialized group of fighter jets with one very specific job: hunting and destroying enemy radar systems. These aircraft don't wait around for radar to find them first. They actively hunt for it using passive sensors that pick up a radar signal the moment it switches on. Once that signal is detected, the radar system becomes a target within seconds. This job matters enormously because before any heavy bomber can safely enter contested airspace, someone has to blind the enemy's ability to see it coming. That's exactly what these jets are trained to do. And reports confirm 2 full squadrons of them have now arrived in the region, flying in directly from bases in Germany and the United States. They're now operating alongside multiple squadrons of advanced multi-role fighters from different branches of the military. Meanwhile, refueling aircraft have been stacking up over European airspace, effectively building a bridge of fuel and supplies flowing straight into the region without that constant stream of tankers and cargo planes. None of the frontline combat aircraft could keep flying missions for long. It's the unglamorous part of war that never makes headlines. But without it, nothing else works. People rarely think about tankers when they think about war. They picture the bombers, the fighter jets, the dramatic footage of explosions. But none of that happens without the boring, unglamorous machinery of logistics working perfectly in the background. A fighter jet without fuel is just an expensive piece of metal sitting on a runway. The real story of any military buildup isn't the aircraft everyone sees. It's the invisible chain of tankers, cargo planes, and supply routes that make everything else possible. Right now, that chain is being stretched across an entire ocean, and it's being stretched fast. Behind the visible show of force sits a much quieter, much larger effort. Moving one single bomber wing into position along with the fuel, the weapons, and the maintenance crews needed to keep it flying takes weeks of careful planning. This isn't something that happens because of one phone call. Heavy equipment moves by sea, slower but able to carry massive loads. Anything considered urgent moves by air instead, faster but far more expensive. Right now, both methods are being used at the same time, around the clock, and the pace of it all says one thing very clearly. This is not a quiet, subtle buildup. This is a deliberate, visible show of readiness designed to hand the American commander-in-chief every possible option and designed to make Iran's leadership feel the pressure with every single hour that passes. Doctrine has a way of revealing intent long before any actual strike does. And this week, both sides put their doctrine on the record out loud for the world to hear. Iran's foreign minister addressed the nation's strategy directly, describing it in 3 simple words: an eye for an eye. On the surface, that sounds measured. It sounds like a promise of proportional response. Nothing more, nothing less. But analysts studying that statement point to something deeper hidden inside it. It reveals a doctrine built entirely around reaction, not initiative. Iran isn't claiming the ability to strike first with confidence. It's only promising to match whatever comes its way. That distinction matters because it exposes a posture built on limited options rather than real strength. Notice what that phrase actually admits, even if it wasn't meant to. A country confident in its own strength usually speaks in terms of what it will do, not just what it will match. Promising only to respond rather than promising to act tells you something about where the real leverage sits in this relationship. It's the language of a side playing defense, dressed up to sound like strength. The Revolutionary Guard went even further than its own foreign minister. It publicly named a specific airbase in the United Kingdom as a legitimate target. The very same base currently hosting fighter jets flying missions into Iranian airspace. For months, that same paramilitary organization has openly labeled the United Kingdom's military a terrorist entity. Naming a foreign base as a target isn't just angry rhetoric anymore. Iranian officials are framing it as a formal warning. The United Kingdom's response came fast, and it came firm. Officials stated clearly that the country is prepared to defend itself at any time, day or night. For a government often criticized for cautious, careful language, that statement stood out as unusually direct. While Iran was defining its doctrine as purely reactive, the United States defined something completely different. A senior American official addressed the same question of retaliation, but rejected the entire idea of matching Iran's actions on equal terms. Instead, that official introduced a new phrase into this conflict: a head for an eye. The meaning behind it was made explicit. Whatever Iran spends on an attack, the American response will cost more, and it will not shrink down to match the size of whatever Iran chooses to do. In simple terms, the United States is walking away from the old idea of tit-for-tat retaliation entirely. It's replacing that old framework with something far more unsettling for Iran to plan around: a doctrine of disproportionate consequence. This is a genuinely significant shift in the rules of engagement, and it wasn't whispered behind closed doors. It was stated openly on the record by a member of the president's own cabinet. That single sentence removes any predictability Iran might have relied on when calculating the cost of its own next move. Think about how much this actually changes for planners on the other side. If retaliation is always proportional, you can plan around it. You know roughly what a certain action will cost you, and you can weigh that cost against the benefit before you act. But a doctrine of disproportionate response removes that calculation entirely. There's no longer a stable formula to work from. Every action becomes a gamble with an unknown and potentially enormous downside. That kind of uncertainty is in itself a weapon. It doesn't need to be used to have an effect. It just needs to exist in the mind of the person deciding whether to pull the trigger. If you're starting to see how deliberate all of this actually is, stick with me because it gets even more layered from here. Quick favor before we continue. If this kind of clear, grounded breakdown is helping the picture make sense in your head, drop a comment telling me one word for how you describe this moment. Escalating, calculated, tense, whatever fits. It genuinely helps me understand what to dig into next, and it helps this video reach more people asking the same questions you are. To understand how this new doctrine actually translates into military reality, it helps to look at how American aircraft operate together during a single mission, because none of this happens in isolation. Specialized radar hunting jets go in first, clearing a path by disabling Iran's ability to detect incoming aircraft before it even happens. Only after that path is cleared does the heavy bomber move in carrying the kind of ordnance built to reach deeply buried targets. Multi-role fighters provide cover above the whole operation, watching for anything that might try to intercept the mission mid-flight. Every part of this sequence depends entirely on the part that came before it. Without radar suppression, the bomber can't operate safely. Without air cover, the radar hunting jets themselves become exposed and vulnerable. This is a coordinated system working together, not a single aircraft acting alone. That system is now being aimed at a very specific category of target. Facilities built into mountains engineered specifically to protect nuclear-related infrastructure from exactly this kind of attack. The American president has stated publicly that any location associated with even the consideration of building a nuclear weapon will be struck. The weapon chosen for this exact task is designed specifically to punch through hardened underground structures before it ever detonates, reaching depths that older weapons simply couldn't touch. Taken together, these two competing doctrines describe two very different wars happening at the same time. Iran's stated approach is defensive and reactive, built entirely around matching harm that's already been done to it. The American approach, now described openly by its own officials, is proactive and deliberately disproportionate, designed not to match Iran's actions, but to make any future action too costly for Iran to even consider. The distance between those two doctrines is exactly where the next phase of this war is likely to be decided. Behind every hardened bunker and every delayed ceasefire request sits one simple, uncomfortable question. What is Iran actually buying itself time for? To answer that, analysts are looking at money first before they even look at missiles. For years, Iran's Revolutionary Guard has profited heavily from controlling maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, collecting informal tolls from vessels forced to pass through that narrow waterway. That income stream has reportedly dropped sharply since this conflict began. Reports suggest monthly revenue fell from roughly $300 million down to somewhere closer to $100 million. That kind of financial pressure appears to be exactly what drove earlier decisions to target commercial shipping directly, an attempt to reassert control over the Strait and clawbacks lost income. According to analysts, that's a sign of desperation, not strength. A regime protecting a revenue source, not defending a strategic objective. It's worth pausing on that number for a moment because a drop like that isn't just an inconvenience. That's a two-thirds collapse in a critical income stream, the kind of loss that forces hard choices almost immediately. Payroll for fighters, funding for proxy groups across the region, maintenance for military equipment, all of it depends on cash flow that's now shrinking fast. Wars are expensive even when nobody's winning them, and a regime bleeding revenue. This quickly doesn't have unlimited time to figure out its next move. This financial context helps explain Iran's public request for a 10-day ceasefire. On the surface, that request sounds like an opening for diplomacy, a genuine step toward peace. Analysts view it very differently. A pause of that length would give Iranian forces time to do exactly one thing: rebuild. Satellite imagery and strike footage show a consistent repeating pattern. After a bunker or missile storage site gets hit, excavation equipment moves in almost immediately. Debris gets cleared, access gets restored, and in some documented cases, a mobile missile launcher gets rolled out, fired once, and pulled back into the mountain before the site can be struck a second time. This cycle explains why so many of the excavators themselves have started becoming targets in recent strikes. Destroying the equipment used to reopen these bunkers is now treated as just as important as destroying the bunkers in the first place. This tells you something important about how this war is actually being fought on the ground, away from the headlines. It's not just about destroying a target once and moving on. It's a constant back and forth. Strike, repair, strike again. A cycle that repeats itself over and over across dozens of sites simultaneously. Every excavator destroyed is a small victory that doesn't make the news, but adds up over time. War at this level isn't one dramatic moment. It's 1,000 small ones stacked on top of each other day after day until the weight of them becomes impossible to ignore. Supporting this entire targeting effort is a specific radar hunting system carried by a squadron of American jets. The system works passively, quietly listening for the exact moment an Iranian radar switches on and immediately passing that location to a missile built to home in on the signal. In practice, this means an Iranian radar operator may never even know they were detected before their entire system is destroyed. None of this happens without a much larger, far less visible effort operating quietly behind it. Moving a single bomber wing into position along with the fuel, weapons, and maintenance crews required to keep it flying takes weeks of coordinated planning. Never a single order given on a whim. Heavy equipment moves by sea, slower but capable of carrying enormous loads over long distances. Anything considered urgent moves by air instead. using a constant rotation of cargo aircraft and refueling tankers stretched across multiple countries at once. Despite 13 straight nights of strikes, Iran hasn't been reduced to a passive, helpless target. Its coastal surveillance, missile storage, and air defense networks have all been degraded, but the Revolutionary Guard still holds on to ballistic missiles, drone swarms, and fast attack boats. Recent strikes linked to this network have already reached into neighboring countries, a clear sign that Iran's reach hasn't been fully eliminated, not even close. That last point deserves more attention than it usually gets. A regime under this much pressure, still managing to project force beyond its own borders, tells you the fight isn't over just because the headlines say 13 nights of strikes. Degraded is not the same as defeated. Iran's ability to strike back has clearly been reduced. But reduced capability paired with genuine desperation can sometimes be more unpredictable than full strength ever was. A cornered actor doesn't always behave rationally, and that unpredictability is part of what makes the coming days so hard to forecast with any real confidence, adding another layer of complexity. There are now reports suggesting a rival global power may be quietly assisting Iran in tracking and targeting American forces in the region. Analysts see a clear motive behind that kind of support. A prolonged conflict in the Middle East pulls American military attention and resources away from other global flashpoints, particularly in Eastern Europe. Keeping the United States occupied in one theater limits what it can commit somewhere else entirely. Taken together, all of these details paint a picture of a regime under real financial and military pressure, buying time not to negotiate in good faith, but simply to survive while quietly receiving help from outside actors who benefit from America staying distracted elsewhere. This is where the story stops being just about Iran and starts being about something much bigger. Wars rarely happen in isolation anymore. Every major conflict today sits inside a web of competing global interests where outside powers quietly support one side or another. Not necessarily because they care about the outcome directly, but because keeping a rival occupied somewhere else buys them room to maneuver elsewhere. If that kind of quiet support is really happening here, it means this conflict isn't just a regional dispute anymore. It's a piece on a much larger board, one where the players extend far beyond the two countries actually exchanging fire. If your head is starting to connect all these pieces together, that's exactly what this breakdown is meant to do. Quick thing before we move into the final stretch. If you've made it this far, you clearly want the full picture, not just the scary headline version. Do me one favor and share this with someone who keeps asking you what's actually going on with Iran right now. It takes 5 seconds and it genuinely helps this channel grow. Every war eventually reaches a point where the battlefield and the political calendar start moving at exactly the same speed. And for this conflict, that point may already be here. Inside the United States, lawmakers took 2 very different actions in the very same week. Congress approved $95 billion specifically allocated to fund continued military operations against Iran. At the same time, a resolution aimed at ending U.S. involvement in the conflict passed narrowly in the House of Representatives by a vote of 214 to 208. That same resolution then failed in the Senate, falling short by a margin of 49 to 47. Analysts point out that even if that resolution had passed in both chambers, it carried no binding power over the commander-in-chief's actual decisions. It functioned as a symbolic vote, a signal of political division at home, but never an actual limit on military action abroad. Taken together, these 2 outcomes point in one clear direction. The funding is secured. The political effort to stop the campaign has failed. And right now, there's no legislative barrier standing in the way of further escalation. Analysts interpret this as a strong signal that the administration may choose to intensify strikes now, while political conditions remain favorable, rather than risk losing that window later on. There's a lesson buried in those 2 votes that goes beyond just this one conflict. $95 billion moving through Congress with far less resistance than a symbolic resolution to end the war tells you something honest about how these decisions actually get made. Funding wars tends to be easier than stopping them, politically speaking, because funding feels safe and stopping feels risky. Nobody wants to be the vote that's blamed if something goes wrong after troops are pulled back. That dynamic shapes outcomes just as much as any battlefield decision does, and it's worth remembering the next time a symbolic vote makes headlines without actually changing anything on the ground. This sense of urgency is reinforced by developments happening far outside the Iran theater entirely. In a completely separate conflict, a fighter jet operated by Ukraine has reportedly scored its first confirmed air-to-air victory, shooting down a Russian aircraft. Analysts believe the downed aircraft may be one of 2 advanced Russian fighter models, with additional reports suggesting a third, more modern Russian jet crashed during the same period. Ukraine's success is credited in part to an airborne early warning aircraft, which allowed its pilots to detect Russian fighters before being detected themselves. Experts note that despite generational differences on paper between these aircraft, the jets involved carry fairly similar radar capability, meaning the outcome of these engagements often comes down to a simple factor: who sees the threat first? While this development belongs to a completely different battlefield, analysts see it as part of the exact same broader pattern playing out globally right now, a period where long-standing assumptions about military balance are being tested and in some cases quietly overturned. There's something worth noting in that parallel. Two completely separate wars on two completely different continents, and yet the same underlying lesson keeps repeating itself. Detection matters more than raw firepower. Seeing the threat before it sees you decides outcomes far more often than which side has the bigger, more expensive machine. That's not a coincidence. It's a signal about where modern warfare is actually heading. A shift toward information and awareness mattering just as much, if not more, than brute military size. Bringing the focus back to Iran, the central strategic question becomes much clearer once you lay all of this out together. Iran's entire approach appears built around one central bet: that it can outlast American political will long enough for the regime to simply survive. Historically, that's actually been a reasonable strategy for regimes facing prolonged foreign pressure. Wait long enough and public opinion shifts. Wait long enough and political attention moves elsewhere. But analysts argue the current political and financial signals suggest that particular bet may not hold this time around. With funding secured, legislative opposition defeated, and military assets already positioned throughout the region, the conditions for sustained or even expanded pressure are already in place. If that pressure keeps compounding financially, militarily, and psychologically, analysts suggest it could eventually force Iran's leadership toward the negotiating table out of pure necessity, not choice. Others raise a more uncertain possibility that sustained pressure on the regime could create space for some kind of internal uprising, though a scenario like that would depend heavily on whether any opposition movement inside the country could actually gain access to weapons and organize in time. It's worth being honest about how uncertain that second scenario really is. Internal uprisings against entrenched regimes rarely happen on a predictable timeline, and they almost never happen simply because outside pressure builds up. They require organization, leadership, and often a spark that nobody can forecast in advance. What sustained pressure can do is create the conditions where that spark becomes more possible. It doesn't guarantee the outcome. It just makes certain outcomes more likely than they were before the pressure started. For now, no clear outcome has been decided. What is clear is that the balance of pressure has shifted visibly over just the last few weeks. The political clock in Washington currently favors continued action, and Iran's leadership appears to be running out of quiet options to simply wait this entire thing out. One more quick thing before we head into the close. If breakdowns like this one are the reason you keep coming back, the real way to support that is simple. Tap subscribe right now because a story moving this fast deserves an audience that doesn't miss the next update. There's something worth sitting with here before we close this out. Wars like this rarely end with one dramatic night. One single strike that changes everything in an instant. They end slowly through pressure that builds in layers. Financial pressure, military pressure, political pressure, all stacking on top of each other until something eventually gives way. What we're watching right now isn't the climax of this conflict. It's the moment those layers start compounding all at once, visibly in public for the entire world to track in real time. Every layer on its own might not look decisive. A drop in toll revenue at a strait somewhere in the Middle East doesn't sound like the kind of detail that ends a war. A defeated resolution in the Senate doesn't sound like a turning point either. But history rarely turns on one single dramatic event. It turns on dozens of smaller pressures arriving at the same time, each one manageable on its own, but together forming something no regime can fully absorb. That's the pattern worth watching here. Not any single night of strikes, but the accumulation of every pressure point happening at once. 13 nights of strikes. Two competing doctrines now on the record. A regime bleeding revenue it desperately needs. A ceasefire request that looks less like peace and more like a pause to rebuild. Billions in funding secured on one side of Washington and a symbolic vote defeated on the other. None of these are separate stories. They're all threads of the exact same rope, and that rope is tightening. The coming nights are likely to determine which direction this entire region ultimately takes, and whichever way it goes, it won't happen quietly. It will happen exactly the way the last 13 nights did, out in the open, tracked in real time, one decision at a time. So here's what I actually want to know from you. Do you think Iran is buying time to survive or buying time to rebuild for something bigger? Type your answer in the comments. I genuinely read every single one, and I want to know where this audience thinks this is actually heading. If breakdowns like this one, the kind that connect the dots instead of just repeating headlines, are useful to you, make sure you're subscribed because this story is moving fast and it's far from finished. We'll be here tracking every night of it with you. Thanks for spending this time with me. Take care, and I'll see you in the next